Welcome to the Grateful Life webcast. I'm your host, Ashley Eicher. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the hidden costs of aging and how to prepare with our guest, Larry Steinberg. Larry is the Chief Investment Officer for Financial Architects and Cabin Advisors. With over 30 years of experience, he helps his clients financially plan so they are prepared for any challenges they may face in life. He approaches financial planning with a focus on after-tax returns and spendable income for families. Larry speaks on taxes, alternative investments, indexing, and entrepreneurship at conferences and events around the country. He joins us today from Pasadena, California. Larry, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss this very important topic.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, and I hope I can provide some value and help some people today.
Absolutely. I mean, this is such an important topic for so many people that really we don't talk about enough. So for anyone watching at home, we want to hear from you. If you have questions for Larry, put them in the chat or scroll down to our question box. We're going to be doing a Q&A with Larry toward the end of the show, and we will try to answer as many of your questions as we can. I mean, honestly, I'm really glad we're talking about this because personally, I feel like the cost of aging isn't something that people really talk about often, and it's something that families really struggle to talk about. So my hope for today is that we can provide practical, applicable information that our viewers can start implementing for themselves and their loved ones as soon as possible, and that this can become a less taboo topic among families and caregivers. So Larry, what are some of the hidden costs that people don't really think about?
Well, first off, healthcare costs are on the rise. Inflation is affecting healthcare just like everything else. So people need to be planning on and expecting that their costs are going to go up and that there's going to be increases. So that's first of all. The second thing is that, people know that they have doctor visits and co-pays and deductibles associated with all of that, but they're going to be needing more of that as they get older. You go to the doctor more often, you have to go to specialists. And some of the hidden costs are like you got to actually get to the doctor, right? So, if you're having to take Uber or rideshare to get to the doctor, that costs money. Generally people, when they get older, they do one thing a day, and that means they go to the doctor, then they have lunch after, and then they end up spending money around that. So, it's not just the deductible or the copay. Oftentimes there's these side, and then these expenses can run up, and people weren't really planning on or expecting them. So they're, just like when you were, got your first house and, oh, great, I know what my mortgage is, but then you need to fix the roof or, something else comes along. So there's always stuff that's unexpected. So you got to build some room, some budget, there so that if things are a little bit different, you don't end up in a hole.
I love you mentioned roofs, Larry, because that's something I'm dealing with in my house right now. But you mentioned healthcare expenses. Would you take us through some of the most common expenses that you've encountered when working with your clients?
Well, there's kind of the known expenses, right? Everyone's going to take a look at their Medicare, see what it pays for. Maybe they have a supplement, and then that's picking up some of their costs. But, other things can crop up. Let's just say that you need to make some changes in your home in order to make it easier to maneuver, right? Sometimes those modifications can end up costing tens of thousands of dollars. Or, maybe there's something in the house that just needs to be done just, because you're spending more time there, right? So you end up spending more time at home. You're going to spend more money at home, and you got to kind of plan on having that in your budget, right? You're going to want changes. Things are going to need to get done. Just like when you were younger, there's unexpected expenses. As you get older, there's a whole nother set of them, and you just have to have room in your budget for it.
Well, and expenses are only one way to look at this. So let's talk about the importance of making a financial plan that includes a care plan. What are some components to build into a plan for care and its impact on budget?
So I think that you need a team. I'm a very big team guy, comes out of a sports background. And so your team needs to be built so that you can start dealing with things ahead of time and you can plan for them. So that's going to include your financial advisor, maybe insurance person if you have a specialist in insurance. Your accountant needs to be involved. CPA and the taxes need to be planned for. But then past that, long-term care policies come with care coordination and a care coordinator. You don't have to get that through insurance. So I think that as some of these decisions are in the future, that you want to kind of talk to somebody that does that. And then there's also these specialists that know the facilities in your area, not facilities, but the locations, and they will, and they can help you, plan out where you want to go. And maybe it's a community that's where you want to go. Everyone wants to plan to stay in their house, but maybe that's not the best thing. Maybe they want to to be around other people. Maybe they need that social element. So you want to be planning to give you the most options possible.
Well, and I also think getting your family involved. I think that is so important. So who are all of the parties we should be thinking about to create a well-rounded plan? What are some mandatory mechanisms that need to be crafted, and who needs to know?
So obviously the family needs to be brought in sooner the better. They need to have discussions. Siblings that didn't get along are definitely not going to get along when it comes to helping out with their parents. You might have one that's local and one that lives far away, right? So maybe the one that's local is having more, put on them, and then there's a little bit of issue with their other sibling, or maybe there's 3 or 4, and who can figure out what they're going to do and what they're going to help out with. So you've got to have a discussion of what the roles are, but you also got to put the legal framework in place to help people out. Who's going to have financial power decision? Who's going to have medical powers? Who's making what decisions? So you need to have all that thought out and put into the legal framework ahead of time. Because if you don't, it just creates more anxiety and more stress on everybody.
Well, and so many people plan on staying at home, which of course is also known as aging in place. So what are some of the things to think about in terms of costs there?
The home probably is going to need some changes and some modifications over time, right? It's going to need to be easier to get in and out of potentially. If there's a lot of stairs, if there's 2 stories, then maybe some stuff needs to be done so it's easier to maneuver, easier to get around. And maybe if you're going to have some care come in, then you've got to have maybe some stuff done in order to facilitate that. So the home is going to change down the line. So you want to be able to budget and plan for those changes that are going to make the home able to be stayed in for a longer period of time.
Well, can you talk just a little bit about care plans and wishes and why that is so important and what needs to be involved?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to bring anxiety levels down for people is to have options planned out and have things discussed ahead of time. What really is stressful and difficult is when you have to go and make, spot decisions. You don't have it determined who's making the decision or what the wishes are. So I think it all needs to be talked about ahead of time and then options discussed so that if a decision has to be made, it's kind of already been pre-made rather than it being a pressure situation where you just got to get it figured out all at the time. Because occasionally things happen, things can change very quickly and you need to be prepared for that.
Well, we talk so much about aging in place and that, aging in home, and that's what I think a lot of people want to try and do. But a lot of times we can plan financially, but we don't think about the psychological element of that as well. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, oftentimes these things are horribly stressful, gigantically stressful, right? So that's why if you put that stress and you put it into a small period of time where you haven't had things discussed, you haven't made plans, you don't know who's making what decisions, who's responsible for what, when that happens, it just makes it worse. So it's going to be stressful and it's going to be difficult. But if you want it to be less stressful and less difficult, have the team together, have discussions on who's responsible for what family members are giving what help, what community resources there might be there. That's one other aspect of care coordination is, if you live in a community that has senior rides, if it has Meals on Wheels, if it has some of these other things, then that's a lot different than if they're in a situation where they don't have those resources and that has to be maybe paid for rather than provided for the community. So you need to know what options or what resources are out there. The only way you can do that is to be planning on it ahead of time. And if you do that, these stressful, anxiety-ridden decisions are going to be less stressful and less anxiety-ridden. And, people are going to feel like their needs are being accommodated rather than they're being, dropped wherever there's a room for them.
Right. Well, and some people want the option to stay home and some people don't, but they want to at least be able to do that if they can. And then there's just times where life just happens and we can't plan for it. So what are costs that are affiliated with this choice, and what are things people should plan on that may disrupt this approach or this decision?
So I think that they need to know what what locations are available and what things are good for them to use. So if you know that ahead of time, it's going to be less stressful, right? So once again, it comes down to having the team in place, having thought about some of these things, and then also from a financial perspective, know what your options are. Right? It may be that you want to do XYZ, but if you don't have the money for XYZ, then it's stressful when someone decides that's what they want to do and then they can't, right? And one thing I've discovered through my own clients, in fact, a client situation I'm going through right now, is everybody and their brother who's not doesn't know the full situation is giving advice, right? So if someone says, hey, you should go to XYZ, and XYZ is, more expensive than you can budget, right? That's stressful. They want to go there, but it's not actually doable. So I think that having this all thought about in advance brings it down a lot. That's, build the team, understand what your options are, and, have these discussions.
Well, I think too, finding trusted resources that can help you in different facilities as well. They can speak into what you might need to plan for or what you might need.
Yeah, exactly. So when you've thought about things ahead of time, when you go, then it makes it easier, right? Not all places are alike, and there's going to be some unique needs. Like, I have another situation right now, and that client is really attached to her Pomeranian, right? So the Pomeranian, ever since she became single, unfortunately her husband passed about 10 years ago. The Pomeranian's been there every stretch of the way, right? So now that we're having to make some thoughts about making some changes, like the dog name is Kisses. Kisses has to go with her, right? So we've got to make sure that we've got options to do that, because if the dog and the person who are attached at the hip aren't able to go together, that's going to bring the level up even more.
Well, I think you have to look at various home options as well. Like, what does that look like? Is it part-time care? Is it full-time care if you're trying to stay at home? And then I know that insurance doesn't cover a lot for in-home care. Is that right?
Right. I mean, if you have just Medicare, right, there's a very limited benefit after, like 100 days, that you can kick in. So you're really looking for it either on you personally, or if you've, done some of your own personal insurance, maybe a long-term care policy, or maybe a rider on a life insurance policy or an annuity that gives you access to some money. But typically those aren't going to cover everything, and they're just going to give you some more options and hopefully extend out, your time frame where you have the option to stay home as long when that makes sense. And then if you decide to go to a community or go to something else, you have your options planned out and you can afford it.
Well, and in a senior living community, there is an option for community. Like, it's a
Oh,
part of the word
absolutely.
and having that choice.
Oh yeah, I mean that's sometimes that's a discussion you have to have with people, which is that they want to stay at home, but at home's not working, right? They're lonely. When you're alone with your thoughts, then you don't know what's going on, and you worry about all these other things. And so sometimes people, they need to see the option of going into community where they're with people and just like themselves, where they can talk and have do all social activities and go on trips, right? And do some of these things. And so people sometimes need to be exposed to that so that they know there's an option, because the definitions of insanity is doing the exact same thing and expecting a different result. And sometimes people, when they're at home, they would really need to be out with other people, right? Especially if they were always been a really social person. They've always been into doing things with their friends and family. And now it's a little bit tougher. Being in a place where they have that right there makes it real easy.
Well, and we're going to talk about community in a little bit because I think that is so important. But what are some of the financial considerations for each option, whether it's in-home care or it's going into a long-term facility, that someone should keep in mind?
Well, I mean, just because there's a view out there that in-home is less expensive, and that going to a community or a boarding care, or when the time comes of memory care, is necessarily more expensive. They're not necessarily more expensive, they're just different. So very often, people think that the at-home is going to be less expensive, but at a certain point and a certain level, it becomes more expensive, right? So you got to be looking at what your budget and what you can do in order to think about like what actually is more effective, what provides the best result. So I think that people just need to keep their options open. And one thing that's important is just keep communicating that you need to be open to looking at different things. Because like I said, you come back to that same thing. If their current situation doesn't have them happy, as much as they may be clinging to, I want to do this or I want to do that, if they're not happy and they're not enjoying what's going on, then you need to make changes, right? In order to improve the situation. And the more communication you have with the team and everybody talking ahead of time, I think the more open people are going to be, because change is difficult, especially if change once you get, to a certain point in life. but those changes need to happen in order to get to the end goal, which is to be happy, right? I mean, we all want to be happy. And, you may be at home and you may think that like, oh, I don't want to leave. But then if you're bored all day and there's only so many TV shows you want to watch, maybe going to a place where there's a bridge tournament every night, or, there's a trip to the mall once a day where you can go in and get out, and not have the stress of driving there. I think those options, sometimes people will be more happy. And if you discuss it earlier and you explain it earlier, then I think that, you have more of a likelihood of dealing with these stressful situations and allowing people to be happy. Because at the end of the day, I think that's any of our goal for our friends and family members that are getting older. We want them to enjoy retirement. You worked your butt off your whole life, right? Now it's time to enjoy retirement. We want to make retirement as less stressful as possible. Part of that is being realistic and understanding where you're at, understanding your options, having a team, and having your family there in defined roles in order to give you support.
Well, and so often the individualized at-home care can come with a really hefty price tag, especially if it's 24 hours. And so if you're in an extended care facility, you are able to have those costs shared between multiple people. So it sometimes can help the cost as well.
Oh, absolutely. You need to look at your situation and then look at the cost of the different options, right? Because the financial part of it can be very stressful as well. If you're thinking about, how am I going to pay for everything all the time, then that makes everything more difficult. But if we're looking at like, hey, I know I can afford this because, my financial advisor, my tax guy, and my care coordinator said, hey, we've looked at it. You can afford this. You're okay, right? That you're okay from the team is going to take a lot of stress out of there. Because I've seen people that are so worried about paying for it, but they have plenty of money because they have really strong income, right? They've done good planning and they're okay, but they're so worried about it that it makes things worse. So just having a team of people that can say to you, hey, look, it's okay. You can afford this, right? That, you can do this. It's okay. Right. That oftentimes is a really key part of it. And it needs, I think, to be the family, but also, their trusted advisors around them, people they've worked with for a long time.
Well, and I just think about community. I mean, we mentioned that a little bit earlier. And whether you're 25, 65, or 85, having community around you that supports you, cares about you, and gives you a sense of belonging is so critically important to our mental and emotional health throughout our lives. I mean, for me, that was one of the hardest things in watching my grandparents age. As their friends got older, as they and their friends became less mobile, I mean, the people they loved passed away, they were doing less and less activities with other people, and loneliness and isolation just can be so detrimental to our mental, emotional, and physical health, no matter what age we're at.
Oh, I agree. And then just the fact that they have other people to sympathize with who's going through the same thing, that empathy from everybody having the same scenario, so that they not only get to talk about their kids and their grandkids, but they can sit there and complain about the same stuff and, whine about their, my son only visits me half as much as my daughter. Yeah, mine too. Maybe it's just boys. I don't know. But, the thing I would think that is important is like having other people to talk to that's going through a similar situation. Mental health is really, really important at all stages of life. I think we've seen the mental health crisis we've had with our kids. I got two teenagers right after the last few years. It's no different for the older population. They went through a lot of those same things. So we really need to, have them in an environment where, they have other people to talk to and where they can, maybe, have whining sessions together and complain, and then they feel better about it, then they maybe go out and get a glass of wine afterwards, and then they're good.
I mean, or they could just be playing like bunco or bingo or something like that and building community too. They don't, not just complaining the whole time, Larry.
Yeah, exactly. But that empathy is really important. I mean,
Yeah.
I needed sometimes, right? When as parents, we deal with a certain level of stuff, and so talking to other parents is oftentimes is very helpful as we're going through some of the same times. How are we going to pay for our kids' college? How are we going to deal with this? How are we going to deal with that? It's no different when you're older.
Right.
There you have to just find people to talk to, and it makes you feel better.
Absolutely. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about investment management to start utilizing savings and investments and paying for care. People work so hard on saving, but budgeting and planning cash disbursements later in life can be pretty tricky. There are so many tools that they have. I mean, you could do traditional IRAs, Roth IRAs, 401k, investment accounts, pensions, HSAs, guaranteed minimum disbursements. Like, it can get really confusing and overwhelming. So how should you enlist your team to help you with financial plans when you quickly need to adapt or shift your strategy due to your needs?
So it's all about spendable income and long-term spendable income. So one of the hidden costs people don't think about is taxes. So taxes have to be first and foremost, right? Because they may look at it and say, hey, all right, we're going to pull that, X numbers of dollars a month that's needed out of the retirement plan. That's what it's there for. And then all of a sudden they find out they owe a bunch of taxes on it, right? And so then they have to take more money out of the IRA in order to pay for it. But you owe taxes on that money you come in, and then you just end up in this death spiral to the account when you get to a certain point, where if they maybe had used some of that, but only up to a certain tax bracket, and then they drew on other resources, their long-term spendable income is longer, right? Because you don't want to invade principal if you don't have to, right? But maybe there comes a point where you do that. But if you're creating a 20 or 30% tax burden on the way you're taking money out, then that's not good. So we do a lot of planning on the after-tax income because that's what's spendable. And may have other resources, right? One thing that has been a big advancement over the last number of years has been the ability to use your home equity in a bunch of different ways in order to get money to pay for things. And that's not taxable generally. So because it's not taxable, it may make sense to say, hey, I'm going to pull a little bit of money here because if I pull any money out of the retirement account, I'm going to lose a third to, in some states that have higher tax burdens, half of it to taxes, right? And then if that money for taxes has to come back out of that retirement plan, I said it before, you end up in a death spiral in these retirement accounts, and you're thinking it's going to last 10, 15, 20 years, and it's done in 5, right? So
Right.
the other thing to think about is inflation hits everywhere. So all these expenses are going to go up. And so you've got to be having a plan for, okay, when the costs go up, how can I get that little bit more money I need each year to compensate for inflation in order to bring up the spendable income to the new set of expenses? So you've got to be thinking about that too, not just the current income, but how we're going to grow the income. And once again, after tax income.
Well, and how can you communicate this plan about your care wishes and what you want to have in place with your family? Because like we said earlier, this can be something that's really difficult to talk about. So what are some things that you recommend?
Well, I mean, you got to start the discussion early, right? Because if you wait until things are already having some issues, then it becomes more stressful and everybody is more stressed out. And, with siblings, oftentimes, so-and-so thinks that the other one was favored and they think the other one was favored because, one got tennis lessons and the other one got a bike, So some of these things from when they were little kids, and I have to admit, I have the same issues in my family with my siblings. So, these things happen, right? And so the earlier you can kind of have discussions when there's less pressure on, the easier it's going to be to deal with these things when the pressure's on because something happened and now we've got to make changes. And if we've kind of figured out who's doing what and we know what the wishes are and we kind of know what the idea is, then it's easier to fulfill that, right? Because one thing people don't understand is it's not like you can flip a switch one day and do X, Y, Z. Oftentimes there needs to be a plan. I have one client right now and we're looking at moving into one place for her just because it's time because we're starting to have the beginning of the memory issues, but we don't have an immediate issue, right? So now she can figure out the 1 or 2 places and now we can get on the waiting list, right? So she can get in and at the appropriate time rather than like, okay, you're going to go to wherever there's an open slot because where I live, there's, the good facilities have waiting lists, right?
Right.
And so you may not be able to get in immediately. So, but if you get into a lesser place, then you can't get on the waiting list, right? So if we do a little planning, maybe get them to a place that has a little better accoutrements, to get them to a place where there is longer hours, that people can come visit or have more other things that go on. Or, and I'm a big dog guy, right? The one where your dog can go or the one where your dog can't, right? That can be a huge issue.
Right. What are some strategies to consider when it comes to paying for senior living? Like, how does one create the right amount of cash flow? How do you use investments, equity, or long-term care insurance? What are some of the options?
So you got to look at everything you've got, see what the income potential off it is, and see what the tax implications for using it is. Like I said, a big mistake is people hit retirement accounts early and blow through those because the taxes are there. But maybe if they had a little bit of Roth money, right? So they use a little bit from the Roth to keep that down. And then maybe we look at a home equity and a reverse mortgage. And I'm not advocating any of these. This is all case by case situation. And therefore we can actually keep the assets going longer because we're dialed down the taxes. Because once you've paid tax, it's gone, right? So I think that the tax management is absolutely an area that I see missed a lot. And a lot of times people are referred in and come into me and it's too late, right? They've already blown through half the IRA because they weren't looking at some other options they had. And also, you got to understand how the insurances work. If you have long-term care insurance, right? Typically, there's a pool of money you can use, but there's an inflation increase with it, right? So maybe you don't tap that to the full amount you can, because then you can pull a little bit out of the IRA. It's not taxed very heavily or at all. But those benefits actually increase over time. So you've got to be very, very strategic, and you got to know and have a good idea what the assets are. And the layperson, is going to have a difficult time kind of maneuvering that. That's where your professional advisor, your financial advisor, your insurance person, and your CPA need to put their heads together and say, hey, look, this is the scenario. And talking to the person is saying, hey, this is the level of care they might need now, this is where it's going, so let's plan for it, right? That team becomes important. And then you have the kids knowing that, hey, all right, we understand that's where it's going, especially whoever has the financial power of attorney, because that's a key person. That's the person responsible for paying the bills. You got to make sure that person understands that, the accounting that they have to do for their parents and knowing where the money's going is, it's not an easy task. It's going to take time, and make sure they're doing their job to get bills paid.
Well, and I want to mention, we talked about this at the top of the show, and if you guys are just joining us, we are going to have a Q&A at the end of the show a little bit later. And so if you have questions for Larry, I know we're covering a lot of information, but if there are specific questions you want to ask, make sure you add those in the chat or down at the question box at the bottom of the screen. Now, Larry, you mentioned a number of different options to consider using to pay for senior living. Can you give us an example of what a plan may look like in round figures? Give me some numbers and how long-term care insurance may be a tool to cover part of this.
Right. So most plans have a pool of benefit that's based on a daily number that they can access, right? And they can access up to that. And then usually there's an inflation adjustment that comes with that. So every year that pool will grow. But if you pull a dollar out now, it's not going to grow later. So oftentimes you got to look at, okay, well, how much of that do I want to tap into? Because maybe now I'm in a low tax bracket. So if I take some money out of the IRA and cover that, like that, we're going to end up with low or no taxes on the IRA, and we're going to stretch out that spendable income longer, right? Very rarely is that done. Most people tap it, and, and the other thing is that when you're looking to make changes down the line, having a long-term care policy of some sort. Now, I know they've been very problematic. A lot of them have not lived up to what their promises were as far as what premiums would be. So you've got to look at, okay, as I'm drawing down out of it, let's make sure that those dollars spent, especially if they were more than you were planning on, really get their value maximized.
So let's say you've got a plan in place if something should happen, and we decided on if and when we should transition to senior living, if that's what we want to do. We planned, we saved, we dotted our I's, crossed our T's. But as we talked about in the beginning, things don't always go as planned. So how much wiggle room or contingencies should we have in place with our plan?
Well, I mean, people's financial realities are the realities. But I would say that if you figured out that X is the number of budget that you can do right now, try to spend a little bit less, right? Try to be a little bit under and give yourself some wiggle room. Because the other thing is that there's oftentimes a few extra expenses that go along with it, right? So it may be that some of those trips that they do, there's a little bit of cost associated with them, or there's costs associated with going on them because, if they're taking you to the mall once a week to walk around and go shopping, like you're actually going to spend money, right? So just don't have everything planned to the point where there's no wiggle room. Try as much as humanly possible to have wiggle room. Now, I know not everybody's going to have, be afforded that, but, maybe when you have those discussions and you're having somebody that helps you look at different places to go, that they kind of know that like, hey, if we can do a little bit less, it's going to be better for them long term. Because also those costs have been going up at a higher rate than our regular inflation that everybody sees. So we just got to be prepared for that as well.
What are some other support systems that might be out there that people should consider?
Well, I mean, that's where care coordination comes in, because oftentimes there's, you might be in a community that has senior rides. You may be part of a church that has some support mechanisms for older people too. I've seen people's lives literally saved by the support they have from their church. And I've seen, and then just know what else is out there in the community. And, I think senior centers oftentimes provide a lot of resources and places for people to go and get a sense of community at low cost when they're staying at home. And maybe if you have that, you don't necessarily need to have, 24-hour care or somebody in there 10 hours a day. If, you can kind of save that and then just have the senior van take them to the senior center a couple days a week. They're there, right? And then they don't have to be spending money on the caregiver at home. They get the sense of community. They get to play their bingo or do their crochet or whatever it is they may do. I've got some clients that's made some incredible blankets over the years, I can say, they get to do those fun activities and maybe doing it in a group environment. So see what's out there, right? That's the key thing, is like be looking far and wide for different options that you can use.
I mean, Larry, do you just have stacks of blankets at your house that, your clients have given you over the years? Is that what it is?
Well, I'm starting to get stacks of blankets, but that's just because my 18-year-old daughter's got into crochet. And, and so she's actually crocheted with some of my clients. They're into that together. And yeah, so I've got some, I definitely have some nice homemade blankets, and I've got a great aunt who's into that. So there's a few around the house. Just be careful taking them to the dry cleaner.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. Well said. Well said. I love you threw in the dry cleaner. All right, let's transition to our Q&A. Again, if you have questions for Larry, add them to the chat or at the box at the bottom of the screen. So, Larry, first question from our audience. For those who may not have family to help provide care, what are some of the options to consider, and what do they cost?
So I think that's actually where it's more important you have the team. Because I have clients that they are, it's them, right? They don't have kids. The spouse is not there anymore, and I become part of that support system. But that's where it's important, where I build the team, where we have a care coordinator come in, where we have somebody that's going to show them different places where they potentially could go, and where, the accountant is working with us on maybe taking over some of the bookkeeping responsibilities so that we know what's going on with the checkbook, so the checkbook doesn't get overdrawn, or vice versa, there's not a bunch of money sitting there. And also there's a tremendous amount of scams going out there. Kind of the downside of artificial intelligence is the amount of scams, getting people, especially seniors who are already targets, is pretty hard. So, having somebody watch the book. So you build the team around them, and then, you really get an idea. Sometimes you want to bring in a professional fiduciary in place of the family members. That's basically a paid son or daughter that is, responsible for making sure all the decisions are being made to the best of their ability, if they're losing the ability to be able to make a lot of those decisions for themselves. And a really good professional fiduciary is going to have had all those discussions early so they know what the wishes are for later. So even if someone, they don't have to interpret or guess what they really want. They had those discussions before. Now they can have those, now that it's time to implement, they really know what that person wants because they've already been working with them for a couple years.
Well, and you mentioned scams, and I think that's something really important to talk about, because in our family, that was when we knew that one of our family members needed to go into an assisted living care situation. Thankfully, this bank that he had been banking at for decades knew who he was, and he went in trying to pull out a ton of money, basically to give to someone who said they were building a church and he was going to donate to it. and the bank flagged it and shut it down. And we found out that it was a scam, that they were trying to scam him out of money. And so I think, for families to be aware of that too is so important right now. You mentioned options can range in visiting caregivers. Can you talk just a little bit about that, of what does that look like?
So, obviously there's going to be an hourly cost for a caregiver that comes in times the number of, come in, and it's going to be different depending on what they're doing. Are they there just to kind of clean up, cook some meals and for some companionship, or do they need some, make sure medicine is given properly, and maybe there's other things that need to be dealt with. So you need a higher level person in. They maybe need to be, a nurse's aide or have a little bit higher skill training. So it's all going to be down to how many hours. And that's always kind of a negotiation of trying to figure out what the number they need is, and fitting that into the budget and thinking about like, okay, what's the next step after that? So, and then those people need to be vetted very closely too, because, those people can disappear with things. I've seen a number of cases where, that all of the family heirlooms are being done to the caregiver who, manipulated and talked them into changing their will. Right. So,
right.
You got to have a watchful eye on those people as well. And even people that are with agencies that are supposedly vetted and done them, they're having a tough time finding people now, right? So that's driving up the hourly cost. And that's meaning that in order to meet the demand, they're maybe not checking people as hard as they should, So you just gotta, but the more people we have watching what's going on, the better.
Well, and we talk about numbers. What are some of the numbers that you see in your area versus, again, you said you're in Pasadena, California, so the numbers may be different than what we see in Kansas. So can you talk to us about the range of numbers that you see?
Right. So Pasadena, for those people who aren't familiar, is a suburb of Los Angeles, and care is pretty expensive in Los Angeles. You can kind of start out with, probably, it's like $40 an hour to have a caregiver come in per hour. So you can see that that's kind of at the low end, and then they get more expensive. So those costs can rise rapidly. If you're looking at going into like a community, maybe a community type assisted living, or boarded care, you're starting at maybe a couple $1,000s a month in some areas, upwards of $10,000 to $15,000 a month in some other areas. And then when you get to memory care, it's going to go up a lot, and it's going to be up to like 20,000. So obviously in other parts of the country it can be a lot less expensive.
Right.
It depends on what the cost of real estate and what the cost of the labor is, whether they have enough people there. So don't have those numbers frighten you if, but with my uncle, I had an uncle that his wishes were never to leave home. And he made that very, very clear. But the problem was, in his last couple of years, he became an escape artist as his memory went. And, this was in St. Louis, right? So he's escaping in December. So we ended up spending $30,000 a month because we had to have two people there all the time, because make sure he didn't get out the back door, because you see he had this big house and there were 6 ways out and you had to cover him, right? Because he kept on escaping. Right. So, so the cost can vary a lot based on the situation. And I'm very grateful that my uncle was in a financial position that we could give him the care that he needed. When his father, my grandfather, he didn't have all of that taken care of. So my dad's generation, they kicked in and supported him, right? So, you got to look at, family resources as well. But, all of these things, the more you watch it, the more options you have. That's it's important.
Well, and at that point, you also have to consider what are the implications for staying at home versus going to a place that could give more around the clock care too. Like, what is independent living versus that? So I think those are all things to think about. We have a really great question from our audience that I want us to ask. So in enlisting a financial advisor to help with the planning, what are the questions that people need to be asking to determine if a particular advisor is right for them?
So one thing that people need to understand is it's a lot easier to accumulate money to get to retirement than it is to be efficient in spending it in retirement and later. So it's a lot different scenario. So some advisor that may be good at accumulating money, well, when you're always putting new money in, right, you can always grow it. And if you have an off year, it's not, maybe it'll come back later, or but when you get to the the period of time where the money's going the other direction, you have what's called a sequences of return risk, which means that if you have that 1 or 2 bad years is at the front end of your retirement, and that you can literally have half as much money in retirement, right? So, the numbers get really ugly. So you need to have somebody that's planning on, in my opinion, like let's not be having to sell things that have variable, pricing, because if it's a bad year and you're having to sell stocks to meet your retirement, that's not really that good. So you want to have a situation where you're having, income created, right? And you want that income to potentially be higher than what they need so that you can sock a little bit extra away and you can grow that income. So, and then oftentimes you got to look at the tax aspect of it too. So just because a financial advisor is good at the accumulation phase doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be good at the phase of planning and spending it out. So you need to specifically ask them, okay, what does your clientele look like, right? Who are you working with? Because if they're working with, one group and they don't have any experience with, people in the spending phase of their life, well, you don't want to be their tuition on what mistakes to make, right?
Right.
You want somebody that has a good deal of retired clients and that has people they can bring in to be part of a team in order to make that money last, because it's two very different skill sets.
Right. Well, so how do you work with a professional to craft a budget for covering the costs of in-home, short-term care, and then senior care?
Well, I mean, you need to ask them, okay, how much, here's what I've got. How do we spend it most efficiently? And how do we plan for the tax side of it, right? So, they can come up with a number that's like, hey, I can produce X dollars, a year of income. But like, okay, now what's the after tax? Like what after taxes? Because that's what really matters. It's not what you make, it's what you keep, and it's what you can spend, right? So if you've got, $5,000 a month of income, and you say, hey, that's going to cover the cost. But if that's all taxable, right, then you're going to lose maybe 20% of it to tax. And you're only looking at really having $4,000 a month of income, right? So you've got to look at, okay, what other things can we do? Can they plan around maybe the use of the home efficiently? Can they plan around, different insurance that you may have? And can they be looking at what resources they can bring in? Do they have a care coordinator they work with? Do they have somebody they know that can find the right facility for the person when the time comes? So, that's all things that need to be thought out. So I'm a big team guy, sports background. What do they have a team, right? Are they part of a team? Can they play well with others?
Well, and then let's talk about long-term care insurance for just a second, because we had one of those questions from the audience too. When is the right time to sign up for long-term care insurance, and how far in advance before you intend to use it?
So the earlier you purchase it, the lower the cost is going to be for the benefit you're buying. So if you had a crystal ball and knew when you were going to need it, then, that would be, then you could, make it would be easier. But first of all, there's a lot of different kinds of policies, a lot of different types of structures. If somebody is a business owner, it's a lot different than if they work a 9-to-5 job, because if they can create it as a business expense, they get a tax deduction with it. But if they're a 9-to-5er, they're paying for it with after-tax dollars. So there's a lot of questions to go into it. Also, do they qualify for it, right? Can they get it based on their existing health conditions? So it's a very complicated question. And you need somebody, but I will say this, some people that are specialists just in those sometimes miss the bigger picture. So it can't be done in a vacuum. It's got to be done, if somebody's spending all of their surplus income on the long-term care policy and they don't have any surplus for the rest of their retirement, that's a problem. So there's got to be a balanced approach, and you got to have a team. And you've got to be looking at what different options are, because there's some life insurance contracts. And I'm not a big life insurance guy. I think insurance is often very much oversold because there's some conflicts between the advisor and the client as far as compensation go. But potentially that can be a solution. And once again, it's much different if you're maybe a business owner versus somebody that's a 9-to-5er. But definitely looking at your options earlier and younger is a good idea. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to do it. But I mean, definitely when you're my age in the mid-50s, it needs to be thought out.
How does long-term care pay out, and then what does it cover or pay for?
So that's going to be policy by policy. There's these, I don't want to go too in depth to it because you can spend hours on that, but there's certain, it gets triggered by, these what are called activities of daily living. And generally, if you can't do two or more of them, then you can trigger benefits. And then generally the benefits are a pool of dollars and, with a limit on what can be spent per day. And so that's kind of part of the picture when you buy a policy. It's like, okay, unless you're super wealthy, you really are going to have a tough time paying for, all of the potential costs there. So what you're looking at doing is doing some risk transfer and transferring part of the risk of that need to the insurance company, who's then going to have the obligation to, pay out for you. And then you do need to look at the different insurance companies as far as how they handle things, because, some companies are pretty good about getting benefits paid, and other ones, part of their, just like car insurance, part of their modus operandi is to fight claims, right?
Right.
So you kind of need to know what you're working with there.
So completely off of that question, it was a question that came from our audience. What can be done about long-term care insurance that's denied paying a legitimate claim, especially when you have a life event and you need the money immediately?
Oh, it's the doctors. You got to go and have the doctors write up the report and, be answering the questions, and so you need to enlist the help of your doctor in that process. And that's not necessarily that easy. There's a lot of stress put on doctors in the current environment, and your general practitioner type doctor you're going to be working with, they're not doing as well as the specialists are. So for them to spend a bunch, an hour or two writing up something detailed to get you in, they're not actually getting compensated for that. So you got to know that you have a doctor that's going to be willing to go to, to help you, or rather than somebody that's like, okay, I filed the medical reports, you got to deal with that, versus a doctor that's going to do a write-up that says, hey, look, this policy, says that if they can't do X, Y, and Z, and I'm certifying as their doctor, they can't do X, Y, and Z.
Right. We're getting so many great questions for our audience, so you guys keep them coming. How do you find a professional fiduciary, and what are your options regarding where to find them? This is a multi-part question, Larry. Okay. What is the process for engaging them? Where do fees start, and how are they calculated?
Okay, so you got to understand that fiduciary is a wide term. Technically, I am a fiduciary on the investment side, right? So there's also, retirement plans for work. They have fiduciaries associated with like 401k plans. What I'm talking about is a fiduciary, a professional fiduciary licensed, that is what they do is they represent older people in order to protect their interests, right? So that's a specific kind of fiduciary. In most parts of the country, they have a society or an organization that certifies them, and you can go to that to get help. And if you're looking at somebody that isn't there and you can't verify that their fiduciary status through some sort of licensing board, then, be hesitant, right? So so you've got to look to the local board, and then you've got to look to, how they charge. So some will charge hourly based on amount. A lot of them, especially people that have a little bit more resources but maybe don't have kids, they're going to charge a percentage of the, kind of like the financial advisor does. They'll charge a percentage of the assets they're responsible for monitoring. And you just got to look at it, make sure that the services they're providing are in line. But I do think that there are certain occupations where, like, the local licensing group is not of value. But in my personal experience, the association groups around the professional fiduciaries are very good. So I would say you definitely want to make sure they're licensed through one of those. And also, if other resources in the group, maybe your CPA or accountant knows people they've worked with before. But I definitely would, before hiring somebody, have them very much checked out, because they are getting a good deal of power over your financial situation.
Well, and you mentioned for some of them working hourly. Are there other options there of how they get paid, and how do you know
most of them,
in your best interest?
Most of them actually charge based on the amount of assets that you have, in order to, because that's kind of what their responsibility and their liability is. And most of them are attorneys, right? So they're, as a licensed attorney, they're going to have responsibilities there as well. There is a kind of a conflict on doing it on the hourly basis because, they're responsible for looking at what you need, and therefore they can make the judgment you need more hours and charge you more, right?
Right.
That's why I kind of like the asset under management model, because they're not getting compensated based on running up a bill on you, right?
Right.
So they're just responsible for making sure. So at some points in time, they may be working a lot more for you and other times less, but at least you can budget in that number and know kind of what it is. And then the financial advisor is going to kind of build that in, like, okay, X amount of dollars based on their assets is going to that. So let's make sure we have the money coming off the investments in order to pay that, right?
Right.
But I think that those people really do, the good ones really do a great job of protecting their clients. I work with a number of fiduciaries very closely, and they really are the best friend, because sometimes, you have a scenario where we've seen a lot, especially in the last couple of years, where in order to pay for the facility, the people had to move out of their house and rent it out, right?
Right.
And we had these periods and problems where people didn't have to pay rent, right? So the fiduciary was able to go in and kind of push the rent issue, because if it was just, mom needing to collect the rent and nobody was watched in the store, because mom was in a home and having some memory issues, without the fiduciary, like, that whole thing collapses, right?
Absolutely.
So they were able to step in and force the issue and say, hey, look, I know you're saying you can't afford rent due to COVID, but we're going to boot you as soon as we're allowed to, and play a guilt trip on them, like, because the person that owns that house, if they get booted out of their facility they're in, well, they're going to get put there, right? And the court can order you out based on the fact of a return to home, even, so that, that's a state by state and really a city by city issue. But those fiduciaries sometimes really need to be there to advocate for their clients.
Absolutely. That is so much great information, Larry. We have another question from our audience. Says, could you please go over all of the ideal components of a valuable team and clarify who coordinates it? Is it the person, a retirement planner, a financial planner, or someone with different expertise and focus?
So I think in the team, you're right, there needs to be a quarterback. And so sometimes that quarterback can be a professional fiduciary, and sometimes that quarterback can be the financial advisor. It's generally not going to be the care coordinator, because they don't have the expertise on the financial side. They just have the expertise on, trying to maximize the resources that are there. I have seen occasions where it's a CPA or an accountant that fills that role, because they have the close client relationship. So, one of those three typically is going to be the quarterback on the situation. But that's also where it's important to have the family members involved, because then the family members also need to be giving guidance and making decisions there. But the key is that the most important thing is there's a team. Who leads the team isn't not necessarily as important as, the fact that they have the team and these people cooperate and can work together.
Well, and again, I think it goes back to finding people that you can trust and are looking out for your best interests, for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And people that have a legal requirement to do so also.
Right,
like
right.
Not to disparage insurance agents, there's a lot of really good ones out there, but insurance agents don't have the level of responsibility of a financial advisor that's working as an investment advisor.
Right.
And because that person has a fiduciary obligation. It's a legal requirement. An attorney that may be involved is also going to have that. Fiduciaries are typically attorneys, right? And so you want somebody that has that legal obligation to be doing the best thing, and not necessarily is tied to a transaction.
Right. Well, Larry, this means so much to so many people watching. Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing so many valuable insights. This has been amazing.
All right. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I'm very glad I was here, and I hope I provided some value to people.
You absolutely did. Thank you, Larry. You can learn more about Larry at the links you see here. And for people watching at home, this webcast will be available to watch again at any time on the Brookdale YouTube channel. So please share this with your friends, family, caregivers, anyone else that you think would find it helpful. Join us on May 23rd at 2 p.m. Central for our next webcast, Mental Health Spotlight, What Seniors Should Know, with Dr. Gretchen Moran-Marsh. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, and I think this is going to be an incredible conversation. You can register now at brookdale.com/webcast. Thank you for joining us on Grateful Life, and we will see you soon.